Nelson Mandela, the man who changed a nation. Imagine spending 27 years in prison for fighting for what you believe is right. Imagine coming out of that prison without anger or hatred, ready to lead your country toward peace and equality. This is the incredible story of Nelson Mandela, one of the greatest leaders in world history. Mandela fought against apartheid, a cruel system that separated people by the color of their skin in South Africa. He was willing to sacrifice his freedom, his family time, and almost his entire life to make his country a better place for all people. When Mandela finally became president of South Africa, he chose forgiveness over revenge. He showed the world that even the deepest wounds can heal when people choose love over hate. Mandela's life proves that one person's courage and determination can change an entire nation and inspire the whole world. Before we begin Mandela's extraordinary journey, please remember to subscribe to our channel, Beginner Bio Stories. We create simple English stories about famous people to help you learn English, while discovering the lives of inspiring historical figures. Now, let's explore the amazing life of Nelson Mandela, the man who became a symbol of freedom and forgiveness. Early life in the Transkei. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mvizo in the Transkei region of South Africa. His African name, Rolihlahla, means pulling the branch of a tree or troublemaker in the Xhosa language. This name would prove to be very appropriate, as Mandela would indeed cause trouble for the unfair system of his country. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakeniuswa, was a local chief and counselor to the Thembu royal family. His mother, Nkafi Noskeni, was the third of his father's 4 wives. When Nelson was 9 years old, his father died of lung disease. This tragedy changed Nelson's life completely. His mother could not take care of all her children alone, so she sent Nelson to live with Chief Jongintaba Dalindiebo, the regent of the Thembu people. The chief had promised Nelson's father that he would take care of the boy and give him a good education. Living in the chief's palace at Mqhekizweni was like entering a new world for young Nelson. He was treated like one of the chief's own children and lived alongside the chief's son, Justice. Nelson learned about African history, traditions, and leadership by listening to the elders speak about the old days when African people ruled their own lands. These stories filled Nelson with pride in his African heritage and planted the seeds of his future political beliefs. The chief made sure that Nelson received the best education available to African children at that time. Nelson attended a local Methodist school where he was given the English name Nelson by his teacher, Miss Mdingane. This was a common practice in South African schools, where African children were given English names because teachers found African names difficult to pronounce. Nelson was a good student who loved learning and reading books. As Nelson grew older, he began to understand more about the world around him. He learned that white people controlled almost everything in South Africa, while black people had very few rights. Black people could not vote, could not own land in most areas, and had to carry special passes wherever they went. This system was called Apartheid, which means apartness in the Afrikaans language. Nelson began to feel angry about these unfair laws, but he was still young and did not know how to fight against them. When Nelson was 16 years old, he went through a traditional Xhosa ceremony that marked his passage from boyhood to manhood. During this ceremony, an old chief spoke to the young men about how white people had taken their land and freedom. The chief said that the young men were becoming adults in a world where they could never truly be free. These words had a deep impact on Nelson and made him think seriously about the future of his people. Education and early awakening. After completing his primary education, Nelson was sent to Clarkberry Boarding Institute, a Methodist high school. This was considered one of the best schools for African students in South Africa. At Clarkberry, Nelson excelled in his studies and participated in boxing and running. He was popular among his classmates and showed natural leadership abilities. The school had both African and white teachers, and Nelson learned to work with people from different backgrounds. From Clarkberry, Nelson went to Healdtown, a Methodist college that was often called the Oxford and Cambridge of Africa. Healdtown attracted students from all over southern and eastern Africa. For the first time, Nelson met young people from different African countries and learned about the struggles of African people across the continent. He began to develop a broader understanding of colonialism and how European powers had divided Africa among themselves. At Healdtown, Nelson was exposed to new ideas about politics and leadership. He met students who talked about African independence and the need for African people to govern themselves. Nelson also learned about great African leaders from history and began to dream of playing a role in liberating his own people. However, he was still focused on his education and planned to become a lawyer or government administrator. In 1939, Nelson entered the University of Fort Hare, the most prestigious institution of higher learning for black students in South Africa. Fort Hare had educated many future African leaders, including Oliver Tambo, Robert Sobukwe, and Seretse Khama. The university had high academic standards and encouraged students to think critically about social and political issues. At Fort Hare, Nelson studied English, anthropology, politics, and law. He was an active student who participated in debates and served on the Student Representative Council. However, Nelson's time at Fort Hare was cut short when he joined a student boycott, protesting the poor quality of food and the lack of student rights. The university authorities demanded that Nelson end his participation in the protest, but he refused. As a result, Nelson was suspended from the university in his final year. Nelson returned home to find that Chief Jongintaba had arranged marriages for both Nelson and Justice. Nelson was shocked and upset by this arrangement. He had always respected the chief's authority, but he was not ready to accept an arranged marriage. In a bold move that would change his life forever, Nelson and Justice decided to run away to Johannesburg, the largest city in South Africa. This decision marked the beginning of Nelson's journey toward becoming a political leader and freedom fighter. Life in Johannesburg. Nelson arrived in Johannesburg in 1941 when he was 23 years old. The city was the center of South Africa's gold mining industry and attracted people from all over the country looking for work. For Nelson, Johannesburg represented opportunity and freedom from traditional constraints. However, he quickly discovered that life in the big city was much more difficult than he had expected. Nelson's first job was as a security guard at a gold mine. The working conditions were harsh, and Nelson saw firsthand how badly black workers were treated. They lived in crowded hostels, worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and were paid very little money. White workers doing the same jobs received much higher wages and better treatment. This experience opened Nelson's eyes to the economic inequalities that were part of the apartheid system. After leaving the mine, Nelson found work as an articled clerk at a law firm called Witkin, Seidelsky and Eidelman. The firm was owned by Lazar Seidelsky, a white Jewish lawyer who treated Nelson with respect and encouraged his ambitions to become a lawyer. Working at the law firm gave Nelson the opportunity to observe how the legal system worked and how it was used to enforce apartheid laws. While working at the law firm, Nelson completed his Bachelor of Arts degree through correspondence courses with the University of South Africa. He then began studying law at the University of the Witwatersrand, one of the few universities in South Africa that accepted black students. At WITS, as the university was known, Nelson met white students and professors who opposed apartheid. He also met Indian students who were fighting against racial discrimination in their own communities. During his time at university, Nelson met many people who would play important roles in his future political career. He became friends with Oliver Tambo, who would later become president of the African National Congress, Inc. He also met Indian political activists like Ahmed Kathrada and Ismail Mir, who introduced him to the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolent resistance. Nelson's political awareness grew rapidly during his years in Johannesburg. He began attending political meetings and reading books about African history and politics. He learned about the ANC, which had been founded in 1912 to fight for the rights of African people in South Africa. However, Nelson initially thought that the ANC was too conservative and focused too much on making polite requests to the white government rather than demanding real change. In 1944, Nelson joined the ANC and helped to form the ANC Youth League along with Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. The Youth League wanted the ANC to take more aggressive action against apartheid. They organized boycotts, strikes, and protests to challenge unfair laws. Nelson quickly became one of the leaders of the Youth League and began to develop his skills as a political organizer and speaker. The freedom fighter emerges. The year 1948 marked a turning point in South African history and in Nelson Mandela's life. The National Party, which represented white Afrikaner interests, won the general election and began implementing apartheid as the official policy of the government. New laws were passed that made racial segregation even more severe and restricted the rights of Black, Indian, and mixed-race people even further. Under apartheid, every person in South Africa was classified into one of four racial categories: white, Black, Indian, or colored, mixed race. People were required to carry identity documents showing their racial classification at all times. Black people were forced to live in designated areas called homelands or townships, which were usually far from the cities where they worked. They needed special permits to travel to white areas, even to go to their jobs. The apartheid government also passed laws that severely limited education for Black children. The Bantu Education Act was designed to prepare Black children only for menial jobs and to prevent them from developing the skills needed for professional careers. Nelson and other ANC leaders understood that these educational restrictions were meant to keep Black people powerless and dependent on white employers. In response to these new apartheid laws, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign in 1952. This was a campaign of non-violent civil disobedience, inspired by the methods that Mahatma Gandhi had used in India. Protesters deliberately broke apartheid laws by sitting in white-only sections of trains, using white-only facilities, and staying out after the curfew imposed on Black people. When they were arrested, they went to jail willingly without paying fines or bail. Nelson played a leading role in organizing the Defiance Campaign. He traveled around the country speaking at rallies and encouraging people to join the protest. The campaign was a great success, with more than 8,000 people arrested for breaking apartheid laws. The campaign also greatly increased membership in the ANC and made Nelson a well-known figure in the freedom struggle. During the Defiance Campaign, Nelson opened South Africa's first Black law firm in partnership with Oliver Tambo. Their law office was always busy because Black people faced constant legal problems under apartheid. They helped people who were arrested for not carrying their passes, families who were being forced to move from their homes, and workers who were being cheated by their employers. The law firm gave Nelson financial independence and allowed him to support his growing family. In 1944, Nelson had married Evelyn Mace, a nurse he met through Walter Sisulu. They had 4 children together: Thembai, Makaziu, who died in infancy, Makgatho, and another daughter also named Makaziu. However, Nelson's increasing involvement in politics put a strain on his marriage. He was often away from home, attending meetings or organizing protests, and Evelyn felt that politics was taking him away from his family responsibilities. The struggle intensifies. As the 1950s progressed, the apartheid government became increasingly harsh in its treatment of black South Africans and political activists. The government banned the ANC and other political organizations, making it illegal for them to hold meetings or publish newspapers. Many leaders were arrested and imprisoned, while others were banned from speaking in public or traveling freely within the country. In response to the government's crackdown, Nelson and other ANC leaders decided that nonviolent protests were no longer sufficient. In 1961, they formed a military wing of the ANC called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation in Zulu. Nelson became the leader of this organization, which planned to carry out acts of sabotage against government buildings, power stations, and other symbols of apartheid rule. The decision to use violence was not taken lightly. Nelson and his colleagues spent months debating whether armed resistance was morally justified. They concluded that the government's violence against innocent people left them no choice but to defend themselves and their communities. However, they were careful to target buildings and infrastructure rather than people, hoping to avoid civilian casualties. Nelson traveled secretly to other African countries to receive military training and to ask for support from other African leaders. He met with leaders in Algeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia, who promised to provide weapons and training for the South African freedom fighters. This trip gave Nelson a broader perspective on the African independence movement and convinced him that apartheid would eventually be defeated. When Nelson returned to South Africa, he went into hiding to avoid arrest. He lived in safe houses, used false identities, and moved constantly to stay ahead of the police. During this time, he was known as the Black Pimpernel, after a fictional character who evaded capture by using disguises and clever tricks. Nelson continued to lead the ANC's underground activities and planned sabotage operations. However, Nelson's luck ran out on August 5, 1962, when he was arrested by police while returning from a secret meeting. Many people believe that the police were tipped off by informers within the ANC or by foreign intelligence agencies. Nelson was charged with leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and sent to Robben Island, a small island off the coast of Cape Town that served as a maximum security prison. While Nelson was in prison, the police raided the secret headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe and arrested many of the organization's leaders. They found documents that provided evidence of the sabotage campaign and Nelson's role in planning it. In 1963, Nelson and 7 other leaders were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The trial became known as the Rivonia Trial, named after the suburb where the secret headquarters was located. The Rivonia Trial and Prison Years. The Rivonia Trial began in October 1963 and became one of the most important political trials in South African history. Nelson and his co-defendants were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to commit sabotage, crimes that carried the death penalty. The trial attracted international attention and focused world opinion on the injustices of apartheid. Nelson used the trial as an opportunity to explain why he and his colleagues had turned to violence. In his famous speech from the dock, Nelson said, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." This speech became one of the most famous political speeches of the 20th century. Nelson's dignity and eloquence impressed people around the world and helped to build international support for the anti-apartheid movement. The speech also showed that Nelson was willing to sacrifice his life for the principles he believed in. On June 12, 1964, Nelson and 7 of his co-defendants were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. They were sent to Robben Island, where they would spend the next 18 years in harsh conditions. The prison was located on a cold, windy island, surrounded by rough seas and sharp rocks. It was designed to break the spirits of political prisoners and cut them off from the outside world. Life on Robben Island was extremely difficult. The prisoners were kept in small cells with only a mat to sleep on and a bucket for a toilet. They were forced to do hard labor in a limestone quarry, breaking rocks under the hot sun. The food was poor, and medical care was limited. The prisoners were not allowed to receive newspapers or listen to radio broadcasts, and they could write and receive only one letter every 6 months. Despite these harsh conditions, Nelson and his fellow prisoners refused to give up hope. They organized educational programs and taught each other about law, history, and politics. The island became known as Mandela University because so many future leaders received their political education there. Nelson continued to study law and eventually earned his law degree while in prison. Nelson also maintained his physical fitness by exercising regularly in his cell. He did push-ups, sit-ups, and ran in place for hours each day. This discipline helped him stay mentally strong during the long years of imprisonment. Nelson also used his time in prison to reflect on his beliefs and to develop his philosophy of reconciliation and forgiveness. Throughout his imprisonment, Nelson never lost sight of his goal of creating a free and democratic South Africa. He refused several offers from the government to release him in exchange for giving up his political activities. Nelson insisted that he would only accept freedom if all political prisoners were released and if the government committed to ending apartheid. International pressure and growing support. While Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island, the anti-apartheid movement gained strength both within South Africa and around the world. Young black South Africans, inspired by Mandela's example, continued to resist apartheid through protests, strikes, and acts of sabotage. The most significant of these protests occurred in Soweto in 1976, when thousands of students demonstrated against the government's attempt to force them to learn in Afrikaans rather than English. The Soweto Uprising, as it became known, was brutally suppressed by police, who killed hundreds of students and wounded thousands more. Pictures of young people being shot by police were broadcast around the world and shocked international public opinion. The uprising showed that apartheid could not survive without constant violence and repression. International pressure against apartheid grew stronger throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Many countries imposed economic sanctions on South Africa, refusing to trade with or invest in the country. Universities, churches, and other organizations around the world launched campaigns to pressure their governments and institutions to cut ties with South Africa. The Free Nelson Mandela campaign became a symbol of the international struggle against apartheid. Musicians, actors, and other celebrities joined the anti-apartheid movement and helped to keep Nelson's name in the international spotlight. Songs like Free Nelson Mandela by the Specials became popular around the world, and concerts were held to raise money for the anti-apartheid movement. Nelson became the world's most famous political prisoner, and his birthday was celebrated by supporters around the globe. Inside South Africa, the apartheid government faced growing economic problems as a result of international sanctions and domestic unrest. The cost of maintaining the apartheid system and fighting various liberation movements was enormous. Many white South Africans began to realize that apartheid was not sustainable and that some kind of political settlement would be necessary. In 1982, Nelson was transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison near Cape Town. The conditions at Pollsmoor were somewhat better than at Robben Island, and Nelson was allowed more visitors and contact with the outside world. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered to release Nelson if he would publicly renounce violence. Nelson's response was read by his daughter Zinzi at a public rally. "I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free." As the 1980s progressed, secret contacts began between the apartheid government and Nelson Mandela. Government officials realized that Nelson was the key to any peaceful settlement of South Africa's racial conflict. Despite being in prison, Nelson had maintained his position as the most respected leader of the black majority, and no agreement would be possible without his participation. The long walk to freedom. In 1988, Nelson was diagnosed with tuberculosis and was transferred to a hospital and then to Victor Verster Prison, where he was given a house and more comfortable conditions. The government hoped that better treatment would encourage Nelson to be more flexible in negotiations. However, Nelson used his improved conditions to increase pressure for a complete end to apartheid, rather than just reforms to the system. Secret negotiations between Nelson and government representatives became more frequent and serious in the late 1980s. Nelson insisted that any agreement must include the release of all political prisoners, the return of exiles, and the establishment of a democratic government based on majority rule. The government initially hoped to maintain white control while giving black people some limited political rights. But Nelson made it clear that such compromises were unacceptable. The international situation also worked in favor of change in South Africa. The Cold War was ending, and the Soviet Union was no longer supporting liberation movements in Africa. This reduced white fears that a black majority government would be communist, and made negotiations more attractive to conservative whites. At the same time, international pressure for change continued to grow. In February 1989, P.W. Botha suffered a stroke and was replaced as president by F.W. de Klerk. De Klerk was more willing than his predecessor to consider fundamental changes to the apartheid system. He recognized that South Africa could not continue to resist international pressure and domestic unrest indefinitely. In his first major speech as president, de Klerk announced that he was prepared to negotiate with black leaders about the future of the country. On February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. Millions of people around the world watched on television as Nelson, hand in hand with his wife Winnie, walked out of Victor Verster prison. His first public speech as a free man was delivered to a crowd of thousands at Cape Town's Grand Parade. Nelson called for peace and reconciliation, while making it clear that the struggle for freedom was not yet over. The release of Nelson Mandela marked the beginning of a new chapter in South African history. However, the transition to democracy would not be easy. Violence between different political groups continued, and there were many obstacles to overcome before a new constitutional system could be established. Nelson would need all of his skills as a leader and negotiator to guide South Africa through this difficult period, leading the transition to democracy. After his release from prison, Nelson Mandela faced the enormous challenge of transforming South Africa from a racial dictatorship into a multiracial democracy. The negotiations between the government and the ANC were complex and often difficult, with many moments when it seemed that the process might collapse into violence and civil war. One of Nelson's first tasks was to reunite the ANC, which had been severely weakened by years of repression and exile. Many of the organization's leaders had been in prison or living in foreign countries for decades, and there were disagreements about strategy and tactics. Nelson used his moral authority and political skills to bring the different factions together and establish a unified approach to the negotiations. Nelson also had to deal with violence between different groups within the black community. The ANC was engaged in a bitter conflict with the Inkatha Freedom Party, led by Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, over control of the Natal province. Thousands of people were killed in fighting between supporters of the two organizations. Nelson worked tirelessly to end this violence and build unity among Black South Africans. The negotiations between the government and the ANC took place at the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA, which began meeting in December 1991. The talks were complicated by the presence of many different political parties and interest groups, each with their own demands and concerns. Progress was slow, and there were several crises that threatened to derail the entire process. One of the most serious crises occurred in June 1992, when police and soldiers killed 45 people in the township of Boipatong. The ANC accused the government of supporting the violence and temporarily withdrew from the negotiations. Nelson had to use all of his diplomatic skills to get the talks back on track, while maintaining pressure on the government to end the violence. Throughout the negotiation process, Nelson demonstrated remarkable leadership qualities. He was firm in defending his principles while remaining flexible on details. He understood that compromise would be necessary on both sides if a peaceful settlement was to be achieved. Nelson also worked to reassure white South Africans that they would have a place in the new South Africa, and that their legitimate interests would be protected. In April 1993, Nelson and F.W. de Klerk shared the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in ending apartheid peacefully. The award recognized their efforts to transform South Africa through negotiation rather than violence. However, even as they received this honor, both men knew that the most difficult challenges still lay ahead. The negotiations finally produced an interim constitution that established a government of national unity and set the date for South Africa's first democratic elections. The Constitution included a Bill of Rights that protected the freedoms of all South Africans regardless of race. It also established a constitutional court and other institutions designed to protect democracy and human rights. President Mandela healing a nation. On April 27, 1994, millions of South Africans of all races stood in long lines to vote in their country's first democratic election. For most Black South Africans, it was the first time they had ever been allowed to vote. The images of elderly Black people, some over 100 years old, casting their ballots became symbols of South Africa's transformation from apartheid to democracy. The ANC won the election with 62.6% of the vote, giving Nelson Mandela the right to become South Africa's first Black president. On May 10, 1994, in front of dignitaries from around the world, Nelson was inaugurated as President of South Africa. In his inaugural address, he said, "Never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." As president, Nelson faced enormous challenges. South Africa was deeply divided along racial lines, with huge inequalities in wealth, education, and opportunities. Many white people feared revenge attacks and economic collapse, while black people expected rapid improvements in their living conditions. Nelson had to find a way to meet these different expectations while building a stable and prosperous democracy. One of Nelson's most important decisions as president was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The commission was designed to investigate human rights violations committed during the Apartheid era and to promote reconciliation between different racial groups. Rather than seeking revenge against those who had committed crimes, the commission offered amnesty in exchange for full disclosure of the truth. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was controversial, with some people arguing that criminals should be prosecuted rather than forgiven. However, Nelson believed that the process was necessary to heal the wounds of apartheid and prevent future violence. He set an example by meeting with the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, one of the architects of apartheid, and with other former enemies. Nelson also worked to reassure white South Africans that they had a future in the new South Africa. He kept many white civil servants in their jobs and appointed whites to important positions in his government. He learned Afrikaans and reached out to the white community in their own language. When South Africa won the Rugby World Cup in 1995, Nelson presented the trophy to the team captain while wearing the green and gold jersey of the Springboks, a team that had previously been a symbol of white South Africa. Despite these efforts at reconciliation, Nelson's presidency was marked by significant challenges. Crime rates were high, unemployment remained a serious problem, and many black South Africans felt that change was happening too slowly. Nelson had to balance the demands of his supporters for rapid transformation with the need to maintain stability and prevent white flight from the country. Nelson also faced personal challenges during his presidency. His marriage to Winnie Mandela had ended in divorce in 1996, partly because of her involvement in controversial activities during his imprisonment. However, in 1998, on his 80th birthday, Nelson married Graça Machel, the widow of former Mozambican President Samora Machel. This marriage brought him great happiness in his later years. Elder statesman and global icon, Nelson Mandela stepped down as president in 1999, having served only one term. This decision surprised many people around the world, as most African leaders stayed in power for as long as possible. However, Nelson wanted to set an example of democratic leadership and peaceful transfer of power. He handed over the presidency to Thabo Mbeki, his chosen successor, and retired from active politics. In retirement, Nelson remained active as an elder statesman and global advocate for human rights and social justice. He established the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which worked to promote his values of reconciliation, human dignity, and social justice. The foundation also worked to preserve his legacy and continue his work of building bridges between different communities. Nelson became involved in many international causes, using his moral authority to speak out on issues around the world. He criticized the United States and Britain for invading Iraq without United Nations approval. He called for more international action to combat HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa. He also worked to mediate conflicts in other African countries and to promote democracy and good governance across the continent. One of Nelson's most important post-presidential initiatives was his work on HIV/AIDS. Initially, he had been reluctant to speak publicly about the disease, but he became more active after his son, Macgatho, died of AIDS-related complications in 2005. Nelson used his influence to reduce the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS and to promote prevention and treatment programs. Nelson also became involved in various charitable activities and international organizations. He worked with the Elders, a group of senior leaders founded by Richard Branson and Peter Gabriel, to work for peace and human rights around the world. The Elders included other Nobel Peace Prize winners like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, and Kofi Annan. As Nelson aged, his public appearances became less frequent, but his influence remained strong. His birthday, July 18, was declared Nelson Mandela International Day by the United Nations, and people around the world were encouraged to spend 67 minutes in community service to honor his 67 years of public service. Nelson's health began to decline in his later years, and he was hospitalized several times for respiratory infections and other ailments. Despite his health problems, he continued to receive visitors and remained interested in South African and international affairs. His presence at the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa was one of his last major public appearances. Legacy of reconciliation and hope. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, surrounded by his family at his home in Johannesburg. His death marked the end of an era, not just for South Africa, but for the entire world. Millions of people around the globe mourned the loss of a man who had become a symbol of courage, forgiveness, and the power of the human spirit to overcome injustice. The response to Nelson's death demonstrated the enormous impact he had made on people around the world. World leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people from every continent paid tribute to his life and legacy. President Barack Obama said that Nelson no longer belongs to us, he belongs to the ages. The memorial service in Johannesburg was attended by more than 90 world leaders, making it one of the largest gatherings of international dignitaries in history. Nelson's funeral took place in his childhood village of Kwanu, where he had asked to be buried. Thousands of people lined the roads to pay their respects as his coffin was transported to the burial site. The ceremony combined traditional African rituals with state honors, reflecting Nelson's role as both a traditional leader and a modern statesman. Nelson Mandela's legacy extends far beyond his role in ending apartheid in South Africa. He showed the world that it is possible to overcome hatred and division through peaceful means. His example of forgiveness and reconciliation has inspired people facing conflicts in many other countries. Leaders and activists around the world continue to study his methods and apply his principles to their own struggles for justice and human rights. In South Africa, Nelson's legacy is complex. While he is universally respected as the father of democracy, the country continues to face many of the problems he struggled to address as president. Poverty, inequality, and unemployment remain serious challenges, and corruption has become a major problem in government and business. Some people argue that Nelson was too willing to compromise with white interests, and that more radical changes were needed. However, most South Africans recognize that Nelson's approach of reconciliation rather than revenge prevented their country from descending into civil war and racial conflict. His vision of a rainbow nation, where people of all races could live together in harmony, may not have been fully realized. But South Africa remains a democracy with strong institutions and a vibrant civil society. Nelson Mandela's life story continues to inspire new generations around the world. His autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, has been translated into many languages and remains one of the most widely read political memoirs ever written. His speeches and writings are studied in schools and universities around the world as examples of moral leadership and political wisdom. Museums and memorials dedicated to Nelson's life and work have been established in many countries. The Nelson Mandela Museum in South Africa attracts thousands of visitors each year, while the Mandela House in Soweto has become a place of pilgrimage for people from around the world. These sites help to ensure that his story and his message continue to reach new audiences. Perhaps most importantly, Nelson Mandela's example shows that one person can make a difference in the world. His life demonstrates that even in the face of overwhelming injustice and seemingly impossible odds, it is possible to maintain hope and work for positive change. His commitment to his principles, even at great personal cost, proves that moral courage can ultimately triumph over oppression and hatred. Today, as the world faces new challenges of division, inequality, and conflict, Nelson Mandela's message of reconciliation and his example of principled leadership remain as relevant as ever. His life reminds us that the struggle for justice and human dignity is never finished, and that each generation must do its part to build a more just and peaceful world. Nelson Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." His own life is proof of this wisdom. Through his courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice, he transformed not only his own country, but also the way the world thinks about leadership, forgiveness, and the possibility of peaceful change. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the extraordinary life of Nelson Mandela. His story shows us that with courage, determination, and a commitment to justice, we can overcome even the greatest obstacles and create positive change in our world. We hope Mandela's example inspires you to stand up for what is right and to work for a better future for all people. If you found Nelson Mandela's story inspiring, please subscribe to Beginner Bio Stories. We create simple English biographies to help you learn while discovering the lives of remarkable people who changed our world. Like this video and share it with friends who are learning English. Thank you for learning with us, and we will see you in our next biographical journey.